The town called her a liar. The rancher said nothing, until the truth cost him everything. The town of Willow Creek was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's name, favorite meal, and family history. It sat between wide fields of tall grass and long dirt roads that led to ranches and farms that had been there for generations. People said it was a peaceful town, the kind where nothing bad ever really happened. But peace in Willow Creek often meant people didn't ask too many questions. They believed what was easy. They trusted what felt comfortable, and they turned away from anything that made them uneasy. Alina Harper had lived in Willow Creek her whole life. She was quiet, soft-spoken, and kind in a way that didn't draw attention. Most people knew her as the young woman who worked at the diner on Main Street, serving coffee with a small smile and remembering how regulars liked their eggs. She lived in a small house on the edge of town with her mother, who was often sick and rarely went out. Alina's life was simple, steady, and mostly invisible to the rest of the town. That changed one night when she said she saw something she couldn't forget. It was late and the diner had just closed. The sky was dark with only a few stars peeking through the clouds. Alina walked home the long way, past the open fields and along the road that led near the Moore Ranch. She often took that path because it was quiet and helped her clear her mind after a long shift. That night the air felt heavy, like a storm was coming, even though the sky was calm. As she walked, she noticed a strange sound coming from the direction of the ranch. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make her stop. She stood still, listening. Then she saw something that made her heart beat faster. She couldn't fully understand it in that moment, but she knew it wasn't right. She stood there for a few seconds, frozen, before turning and hurrying home. The next day, Alina told the town what she had seen. At first, people listened. They nodded, asked a few questions, and whispered among themselves. But as the story spread, it started to change. Small details were added. Doubts grew. Someone said she must have been tired. Someone else said she probably imagined it. Before long, the town decided on a simple answer. Alina was mistaken. Willow Creek liked simple answers. At the diner, people still sat in her section, but the way they looked at her was different. Conversations stopped when she walked by. A few customers smiled in a way that didn't reach their eyes. One woman leaned over her coffee and said, "You should be careful about saying things like that, Alina. This town doesn't need trouble." Alina didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice or demand to be believed. She just kept saying the same thing, calmly and clearly. "I know what I saw." That was all it took for the town to label her. They didn't say it to her face, not at first. They said it to each other in the grocery store, at church, in their living rooms. The word passed from one person to another until it became something everyone seemed to agree on. Alina Harper was a liar, or worse, someone who wanted attention. Caleb Moore heard all of it. Caleb had lived on the ranch his whole life. The Moore land stretched wide, with open fields, old fences, and a farmhouse that had been built by his grandfather. He was known as a hard worker, a quiet man who kept to himself. People trusted him because he didn't talk much. In Willow Creek, silence often felt like honesty. When he heard Alina's story, he knew right away that it wasn't just a story. Caleb remembered that night too. He had been out late, checking the far side of his land after one of the fences had come loose. He had seen something in the distance, something that didn't sit right with him. He hadn't gone closer. He had told himself it wasn't his business. He had gone back to the house and tried to forget about it. Now, as the town talked about Alina, he felt a tight feeling in his chest. He saw her at the diner a few days later, standing behind the counter, pouring coffee for a man who barely looked at her. She looked smaller somehow, like she was trying not to take up too much space. Caleb said nothing. At home, his wife noticed the change in him. He was quieter than usual, spending more time staring out the window in the evenings. When she asked him what was wrong, he shrugged and said he was just tired. But he wasn't tired. He was afraid. Afraid of what would happen if he spoke up. Afraid of what the town would say, afraid of what it might cost him. The ranch wasn't just land. It was his family's history, his livelihood, and his children's future. He believed that staying silent was the safest choice for everyone. Alina's life, meanwhile, began to feel like it was slowly closing in around her. Her manager at the diner cut her hours, saying business was slow. A few regulars asked to be seated in someone else's section. Her phone stopped ringing. Friends she had known since school stopped inviting her over. Even at church, people chose pews a little farther away. At night, Alina lay in bed and stared at the ceiling, wondering how telling the truth had made her so alone. She thought about the moment she had stood on that road, heart racing, trying to decide what to do. She had believed that speaking up was the right thing. Now she wasn't so sure. Still, she didn't take it back. One afternoon, as she walked home from work, she passed by the Moore Ranch. She saw Caleb near the fence fixing a loose post. For a moment, their eyes met. Alina almost stopped. She almost said something, but Caleb looked away, pretending to focus on his work. Alina kept walking, her hands shaking at her sides. The town sheriff came by the diner a few days later. He ordered coffee and sat at the counter, asking casual questions. Had Alina been feeling okay lately? Had anything stressful been going on in her life? Alina answered politely, even though she could feel what he was really asking. "Did you make this up?" When he left, she went into the back room and took a few deep breaths before going back out to the tables. Caleb heard about the sheriff's visit that evening. The news traveled fast. His stomach twisted as he sat at the kitchen table, pushing his food around his plate. His son talked about school. His daughter laughed at something on her phone. Life went on around him, normal and warm, while inside he felt like he was standing on the edge of something he couldn't see. He thought about Alina, walking alone on that road, carrying a truth no one wanted to hear. Days turned into weeks. The town settled into its decision. Alina became a quiet warning, a story people told to remind each other not to stir things up. She moved through her days like a shadow, still kind, still gentle, but with a sadness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Caleb watched from a distance. He saw the way people treated her. He heard the jokes, the comments, the doubts. Every time he felt the weight of his silence grow heavier. One evening, as the sun set over the fields, Caleb stood by the fence and looked out across his land. The sky was painted in soft orange and pink, beautiful and calm. It reminded him of that night, how peaceful everything had seemed before everything changed. He thought about the choice he had made, and he wondered how long he could live with it. Alina, sitting on her porch that same evening, listened to the sounds of the town settling down for the night. A dog barked in the distance. A car drove past on the main road. She hugged her sweater closer around herself and stared at the empty street. She didn't know what the future held. She only knew she couldn't go back to the person she had been before. She had spoken up, and the world had answered her with silence. Somewhere, not far away, Caleb stood in the fading light, carrying the same silence inside him. Neither of them knew it yet, but the quiet that had settled over Willow Creek was only the beginning. The weeks after Alina told her story did not get easier. In some ways, they became harder, like walking through thick mud that pulled at her feet with every step. Willow Creek had moved on in its own way, but Alina could feel how the town still looked at her differently. The smiles were polite now, not warm. The greetings were short. People no longer lingered to talk. At the diner, the bell above the door still rang when customers came in, but fewer of them asked for her by name. She wiped down tables, poured coffee, and took orders like she always had, but something inside her felt missing. It was as if a thin wall had been built between her and everyone else, and no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't knock it down. One morning, her manager called her into the small office in the back. The room smelled like old paper and cleaning spray. He didn't look at her much when he spoke. He said business was slow and he needed to make changes to the schedule. Her hours would be cut again. Alina nodded. She thanked him and walked back out to the counter, her hands trembling just a little as she picked up the coffee pot. Less work meant less money. Less money meant harder days ahead, especially with her mother's medicine to think about. That night at home, Alina's mother noticed the worry on her face. She asked what was wrong. Alina didn't want to burden her, but the words spilled out anyway. She talked about the diner, the people, the way the town felt like it was slipping away from her. Her mother listened quietly. When Alina finished, she reached for her hand and squeezed it. "You did what you thought was right," she said softly. "That matters even if others don't see it." Alina wished that was enough to make the ache in her chest go away, but it was. Across town, Caleb Moore felt the same heavy feeling, though for a different reason. He started waking up earlier than usual, long before the sun rose. He would sit at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, staring at the wall, thinking about the road near his land and the night that had changed everything. The quiet that used to comfort him now felt loud. His thoughts kept circling back to Alina. On the ranch, things began to feel off. One morning, Caleb noticed that a section of fence near the far field had been damaged. It wasn't just loose. It looked like something had been pulled apart. He fixed it, but the next day he found another problem. A piece of equipment was missing from the shed. He searched for it, asked his workers, but no one knew where it had gone. Rumors started to move through Willow Creek, as they always did. People said someone had been sneaking around the ranch at night. Others said the land was being watched. No one knew what to believe, but everyone had an opinion. The sheriff came by the ranch one afternoon. He said he was just checking in, asking if Caleb had noticed anything strange lately. Caleb answered carefully. He said there had been some small issues, but nothing serious. The sheriff nodded, but his eyes stayed thoughtful. When he left, Caleb felt a chill run through him, even though the day was warm. Alina heard about the sheriff visiting the ranch through a woman at the grocery store. The woman spoke in a low voice, as if sharing a secret. "Something's going on out there," she said. "Maybe there's more to that story of yours than we thought." Alina didn't respond. She picked up her bag and walked away, her heart pounding. For a moment, hope flickered inside her, but she had learned not to hold on to it too tightly. One evening, as Alina walked home from the diner, she noticed a truck parked on the side of the road near the fields. The engine was off and no one was inside. It made her uneasy. She hurried past, glancing over her shoulder until she reached the safety of her street. At home, she locked the door and sat at the small kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had gone cold. She thought about how her world had become smaller. The town she had loved now felt like a place she had to survive. Caleb, meanwhile, felt like the walls of his own life were closing in. At dinner, his wife asked him again what was bothering him. This time, he almost told her. The words sat on his tongue, heavy and ready, but he swallowed them back down. He said he was just stressed about work. She didn't look convinced, but she didn't push. Later that night, Caleb went outside and walked along the edge of his land. The stars were bright above him, and the wind moved softly through the grass. He stopped near the place where he had stood that night weeks ago. He tried to remember exactly what he had seen, every detail, every shadow. He knew deep down that Alina hadn't made it up. The next day at the diner, a small group of men sat at a corner table, talking in low voices. Alina could hear pieces of their conversation as she walked by. "Sheriff's poking around more now," one said. "About the ranch?" another asked. "Yeah." Guess that girl's story stirred things up. Alina felt her face grow warm. She focused on her work, pretending not to hear, but their words stayed with her. That afternoon, the sheriff came back, this time to her house. Alina opened the door, surprised to see him standing there. He tipped his hat politely and asked if he could come in. They sat at the small kitchen table, the same place where Alina had talked with her mother the night before. He asked her to tell her story again, slowly. She did. She described the road, the sounds, the shapes in the dark. She told him how she had felt, how her heart had raced, how she had known something wasn't right. The sheriff listened without interrupting. When she finished, he nodded. "I just needed to hear it straight from you again," he said. After he left, Alina felt both lighter and more tired than before. Talking about it always took something out of her. Caleb heard about the sheriff's visit later that evening. The news made his chest tighten. He realized that things were moving, whether he wanted them to or not. The next day, he found more trouble on his land. A gate had been left open, and some of his cattle had wandered off. He and his workers spent hours bringing them back. By the time the sun started to set, Caleb was exhausted, but his mind wouldn't rest. As he leaned against a fence, catching his breath, he saw Alina walking down the road in the distance. She was alone, her shoulders slightly hunched, like she was carrying something heavy. For a moment, he almost called out to her. He didn't. Instead, he watched as she disappeared around the bend. That night, Caleb couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet sounds of the house. His wife's breathing was slow and steady beside him. He envied her peace. He thought about the ranch, the land that had been in his family for so long. He thought about his children growing up with the same wide fields and open skies he had known. And he thought about Alina, standing alone against a town that had turned away from her. He began to wonder if his silence was really protecting anything at all. Alina, at her own home, sat on the edge of her bed, looking at an old photo in a small frame. It showed her as a child, smiling with her mother in front of the diner. Back then, the town had felt warm and safe. She wondered if she would ever feel that way again. The days that followed were filled with a strange mix of waiting and tension. People in Willow Creek started paying more attention to the ranch. Cars slowed down as they passed by. Neighbors talked in small groups, their voices low and curious. The town felt like it was holding its breath. At the diner, business picked up a little, but the mood was different. Conversations often turned to rumors and guesses. Alina stayed quiet, focusing on her work, trying not to let the words around her sink in. One afternoon, as she refilled a cup of coffee, a man at the counter looked up at her and said, "You know, maybe there's more to what you said than we thought." Alina paused, surprised. She met his eyes and nodded. "I've always known that," she said softly. He didn't say anything else, but he left a larger tip than usual. It was a small thing, but it stayed with her. Caleb, meanwhile, felt like he was being pulled in two directions. Every time he thought about speaking up, fear rose inside him, fear of losing respect. Fear of losing his place in the town. Fear of what the truth might bring down on his family. But every time he saw Alina's face in his mind, he felt a different kind of pain. A pain that came from knowing he was letting someone else carry a burden that wasn't meant to be hers alone. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in deep orange, Caleb stood at the edge of his field and made a quiet promise to himself. He didn't know exactly when, and he didn't know exactly how, but he knew that this couldn't go on forever. Alina, walking home under the same fading sky, felt a strange sense of change in the air. She didn't know what it was, but she felt like something was coming, something that would either break what was left of her life in Willow Creek or finally begin to put it back together. For now, all she could do was keep going, one step at a time, holding on to the simple truth that had started it all. Somewhere not far away, Caleb was doing the same, carrying his silence like a weight that grew heavier with every passing day. The morning that changed everything began like any other in Willow Creek. The sun rose slowly over the fields, painting the sky in soft shades of gold and pale blue. Birds moved through the trees near the Moore Ranch, and the quiet of the early hours felt calm and gentle. But under that calm, something heavy waited like a storm hidden behind clear skies. Caleb woke before his alarm. He lay still for a moment, listening to the sounds of the house. His children were still asleep. His wife breathed softly beside him. The world felt peaceful, and that almost made it harder to get up. He knew that once he stepped outside, the thoughts he had been trying to push away would follow him again. He dressed quietly and went to the kitchen, pouring himself a cup of coffee he barely tasted. He stood by the window, looking out toward the wide stretch of land that had been in his family for so long. He used to look at it with pride. Lately, it felt like it was watching him back, asking something he wasn't ready to answer. That morning, he decided to check the far field again. There had been too many strange things happening lately. Gates left open, tools moved, marks in the dirt that didn't make sense. He told himself he was just being careful, but deep down, he knew he was looking for something. The air was cool as he walked across the grass, his boots pressing softly into the ground. The sun was still low, and long shadows stretched out in front of him. When he reached the edge of the field, he noticed something different right away. The ground near the old storage shed looked disturbed, like it had been dug up and then covered again in a hurry. His heart began to beat faster. He walked closer, each step feeling heavier than the last. He knelt down and brushed away some of the loose dirt with his hand. What he saw made him stop breathing for a moment. It wasn't something small. It wasn't something easy to explain away. Caleb sat back on his heels, staring at the ground, his mind racing. This was what Alina had been talking about. This was what he had seen that night, only from far away and in the dark. Now it was right in front of him, clear in the morning light. He stood up slowly, his legs shaking. The truth was no longer something he could hide behind silence. It was there on his land, tied to him whether he liked it or not. For a long time, he just stood there, staring. In town, Alina was starting her day at the diner. She tied on her apron and took a deep breath before stepping out onto the floor. She had learned to prepare herself for the looks, the quiet conversations that stopped when she walked by, and the way some people avoided her eyes. That morning, though, something felt different. People were talking more than usual. There was a low buzz in the air, like everyone was waiting for something. A woman at one of the tables leaned toward her friend and whispered, not quite quietly enough, "Sheriff's heading out to the Moore Ranch. Heard they found something." Alina's hands froze around the coffee pot. "What did you say?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. The woman looked surprised, then a little uncomfortable. "Just a rumor," she said, "but people are talking." Alina nodded and moved on, but her heart was pounding. She didn't know whether to feel scared or hopeful. Maybe both. Back on the ranch, Caleb had made his decision. He walked back to the house, each step feeling like he was crossing a line he couldn't uncross. He told his wife he needed to go into town. She looked at him closely like she wanted to ask more, but he just kissed her on the cheek and picked up his keys. The drive into Willow Creek felt longer than usual. Every turn of the road brought a new wave of doubt. He thought about his family, his neighbors, and the life he had built. He thought about how everything might change once he spoke. When he pulled up in front of the sheriff's office, he sat in the truck for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. His hands were shaking. Then he took a deep breath and got out. The sheriff looked up in surprise when Caleb walked in. "Morning," he said. "What can I do for you?" Caleb swallowed. "I need to talk to you," he said. "About what happened near my land, about what that girl saw." The sheriff's face grew serious. He nodded and led Caleb into a small room in the back. They sat across from each other at a plain wooden table. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Caleb began. He talked about the night he had been out checking his fence. He talked about the shapes in the dark, the sounds he had heard, and how he had convinced himself it was nothing. He talked about seeing Alina in the diner days later, knowing she was telling the truth and choosing to stay silent anyway. His voice wasn't strong. It shook. But he kept going. The sheriff listened carefully, asking questions now and then. When Caleb finished, the room felt very quiet. "You understand what this means, don't you?" the sheriff asked gently. Caleb nodded. "I do." The sheriff stood up. "Then we need to take a look at that spot you found this morning." Word spread fast. By the time the sheriff's car and another vehicle pulled up to the Moore Ranch, a few people from town had already gathered at the edge of the road, pretending to be busy with their own business while watching closely. Alina heard about it from a customer who rushed into the diner, wide-eyed and excited. "They're out at the ranch," he said. "Look serious." Alina felt like the air had been knocked out of her. She handed over his change with shaking hands and stepped into the back room, pressing her palms against the counter. This was it. Whatever was going to happen, it was happening now. She didn't go back out right away. She took a few deep breaths, trying to steady herself. At the ranch, the sheriff and his team examined the ground near the shed. Caleb stood a short distance away, his arms crossed, his face pale. He watched as they worked, each movement feeling like it was cutting away another piece of the life he knew. The truth, once uncovered, couldn't be put back. By the afternoon, there was no more doubt. What Alina had seen wasn't just a story, it was real. The sheriff made a call, then another. More cars arrived. The people watching from the road grew quiet. The excitement faded into something more serious, more uncomfortable. In town, the mood shifted. At the diner, conversations stopped when the news came in. People looked at each other, unsure what to say. Some stared at Alina, their faces changing as understanding began to sink in. One woman stood up from her table and walked over to Alina. She hesitated, then spoke softly. "I'm sorry," she said. "I shouldn't have doubted you." Alina didn't know what to say. She nodded, her eyes filling with tears she didn't want to show. More people came up one by one. Some offered quiet words. Others just looked at her differently now, like they were seeing her for the first time. But not everyone reacted the same way. Some people were angry. They felt shocked, betrayed, and unsure who to blame. Whispers started again, this time with a different tone. The name on everyone's lips was Alina's anymore. It was Caleb's. By the time Caleb returned to town, he could feel the change. The way people looked at him was no longer friendly or easy. It was careful, curious, sometimes cold. He stopped by the diner not because he was hungry, but because he felt like he had to go there. Alina saw him walk in and felt her chest tighten. The room grew quiet as people pretended to focus on their meals. Caleb walked up to the counter and stood in front of her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he said, "You were telling the truth." Alina met his eyes. "I know," she said. "I should have said something sooner," he added. His voice was low, almost lost in the quiet of the room. "I'm sorry I didn't." Alina looked at him for a long time. There were so many things she could say. Anger, relief, hurt, understanding. Finally, she said, "I'm glad you did now." It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was something. Caleb nodded. He ordered a coffee, even though he didn't drink it. He just sat there for a while, feeling the weight of the town around him. That evening, the news traveled beyond Willow Creek. Cars from nearby places drove through town. People asked questions. The quiet little place that liked to keep to itself was suddenly in the spotlight. Alina went home after her shift, exhausted in a way she had never felt before. She sat on her porch and watched the sky turn dark, thinking about how quickly everything had changed. She had been alone for so long, and now, suddenly, everyone wanted to hear her. Caleb went home to his family, carrying a different kind of burden. He told his wife what he had done, what he had said, and what it might mean. She listened in silence, her face a mix of worry and pride. "You did the right thing," she said finally. Caleb wasn't sure if that would make what was coming any easier. That night, Willow Creek didn't feel the same. The streets were quieter, but the quiet was different now. It wasn't the calm of comfort. It was the stillness of a town trying to understand itself. Alina lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind full of everything that had happened. For the first time in weeks, she felt like the truth had finally been heard. Caleb sat at his kitchen table, looking at the same wide land he always had, knowing that it would never feel the same again. The silence between them and between the town and its past had been broken. And nothing would ever go back to the way it was. The days after the truth came out felt heavy in Willow Creek. It was as if the town had woken up in a new world, one that looked the same on the outside but felt very different inside. The streets were still there. The diner still opened in the morning. The sun still rose over the fields, but something deep in the town had shifted. Caleb felt it the moment he stepped outside his house. Cars passed by the ranch more often now. Some slowed down, some didn't. A few people he had known for years didn't wave anymore. Others stared, their faces full of questions they didn't ask out loud. The land that had always felt like a place of comfort now felt like a stage, and he was standing in the middle of it. At home, his children noticed the change too. His son asked why people were talking about their family at school. His daughter said some of her friends' parents didn't want them coming over anymore. Caleb didn't know how to explain any of it in simple words. He just told them that sometimes doing the right thing made life harder before it made it better. He hoped that was true. His wife tried to keep things normal. She still made breakfast in the mornings. She still laughed at the kids' small jokes. But Caleb could see the worry in her eyes when she thought he wasn't looking. At night, when the house was quiet, they talked in low voices about what might happen next. About the ranch. About their future. Caleb listened, feeling the weight of every word. In town, Alina's world had changed in a different way. People who had avoided her now smiled when they saw her. Some stopped to talk. Some apologized. Others just looked at her with a mix of respect and sadness. At the diner, her manager gave her back her old hours, saying business was picking up again. But even as things seemed to get better, Alina didn't feel the relief she had imagined. Being believed didn't erase the weeks of being alone. It didn't make the whispers and looks disappear from her memory. One afternoon, as she wiped down the counter, a woman she barely knew came up to her and said, "You're very brave. I don't think I could have done what you did." Alina smiled, but inside she felt tired. She hadn't wanted to be brave. She had just wanted to be honest. The town was busy now. Cars from nearby places came through. People asked questions. The quiet little diner became a place where strangers stopped for coffee and talked about what had happened. Alina served them, listening to their voices fill the room, wondering how her life had become part of something so much bigger. Caleb felt that same feeling when letters started arriving at the ranch. Some were official-looking, with serious words he didn't fully understand. Others were from people he didn't know, offering opinions, advice, or judgment. He sat at the kitchen table one evening, a small pile of papers in front of him, rubbing his temples. His wife placed a hand on his shoulder. "We'll get through this," she said softly. Caleb nodded, but his chest felt tight. One morning, a man from out of town came to the ranch. He introduced himself, asked questions, and took notes. He walked around the land, looking at everything with careful eyes. Caleb followed him, answering what he could. It felt strange to have someone else walking his fields, someone who didn't see memories and family history, but only facts and details. After the man left, Caleb stood alone near the old shed, staring at the ground. He remembered standing there the day he found the truth. It felt like a lifetime ago. In town, Alina began to feel a different kind of pressure. People wanted to hear her story. They wanted her to tell it again and again. At first, she did. She wanted people to understand. But each time she spoke, it felt like she was reopening something inside herself that hadn't had time to heal. One evening, after a long shift, she walked home under a sky full of stars. The air was cool and the town was quiet. She thought about how everything had changed so quickly. She wondered if she would ever feel like just a normal person again, instead of someone everyone looked at as part of a story. She sat on her porch and listened to the sounds of the night. A breeze moved through the trees. Somewhere a dog barked. Life went on, even when hers felt stuck in one moment. Caleb, that same night, sat on his own porch, looking out at the dark fields. He and Alina were only a few miles apart, but their lives felt connected in a way he never would have expected. He thought about going to see her, about saying more than he had at the diner. But he didn't know what words would be enough. The next week brought more changes. Some of Caleb's business partners decided to step back. They said it was just for now until things settled down. Caleb understood what that really meant. The ranch, which had always been steady, now felt uncertain. He walked through the barns, touching the wooden beams his father had once repaired, remembering being a boy and running through the fields without a care in the world. He wondered what his father would have done in his place. Would he have spoken sooner? Or would he have stayed quiet too? At the diner, Alina overheard two people talking at a table near the window. "That rancher is paying for it now," one said. "Guess that's what happens." The other nodded. Still, he did the right thing in the end. Alina paused behind the counter, listening. She didn't feel happy about what Caleb was going through. She didn't feel angry either. She just felt a quiet understanding. She knew what it was like to stand alone. One afternoon, she found a note slipped into her pocket by a customer. It was short and simple. "Thank you for not giving up." Alina folded it carefully and kept it in her wallet. Caleb received a different kind of message that same day. A longtime neighbor stopped by the ranch. The man stood by the fence, hands in his pockets, looking uncomfortable. "I just wanted to say," he began, then stopped. He took a breath. "I don't agree with everything that's happened, but I know you didn't have an easy choice." Caleb nodded. "No," he said, "I didn't." They stood in silence for a moment, the wind moving through the grass between them. The town seemed to split into quiet sides. Some people supported Caleb, others kept their distance. Some felt bad for Alina, others still weren't sure what to think. It was messy and confusing, and no one had clear answers. Alina started spending more time with her mother. They cooked together in the evenings, talked about small things, watched old shows on the small television in the living room. It helped her feel grounded, like she still belonged somewhere simple and safe. Her mother looked at her one night and said, "You look tired." Alina smiled. "I am. But you also look strong," her mother added. Alina thought about that for a long time. Caleb tried to find his own sense of strength. He worked harder than ever, even when it felt like the ground under him was shifting. He wanted to show his family that no matter what happened, he would keep going. But some nights when everyone else was asleep, he sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the papers, the bills, the plans that didn't feel as solid as they used to. He wondered if he had waited too long to speak. One day, Caleb and Alina crossed paths again. It happened at the grocery store. Alina was in the aisle looking at a shelf of canned food when she saw him at the end of the row. They both stopped. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Caleb walked closer. "How are you holding up?" he asked. Alina thought about the question. She thought about the looks, the words, the long nights, the small moments of kindness. "I'm getting through," she said. Caleb nodded. "I'm glad." They stood there, surrounded by shelves and quiet music playing over the speakers. It wasn't a dramatic moment. There were no big words or grand gestures, just two people who had been changed by the same truth. "I know I can't fix what I didn't do before," Caleb said, "but I wanted you to know I think about it, about you, about what it cost you." Alina looked at him. "It cost both of us," she said softly. He nodded again. They went their separate ways, each carrying that short conversation with them. The weeks continued to pass. The attention on Willow Creek slowly began to fade. People from out of town stopped coming as often. The diner grew quieter again. The town started to feel more like itself, though not exactly the same. Caleb still felt the changes in his work, in his relationships, in the way people looked at him. Some doors felt closed now. Others slowly began to open again. Alina found a kind of peace in the small things. A friendly hello from a neighbor. A good day at work. A walk under the evening sky. She knew she would never forget what had happened. But she also knew she didn't want to live inside it forever. One evening, she sat on her porch and watched the sunset paint the sky in warm colors. She felt a quiet sense of hope, small but real. Across town, Caleb stood at the edge of his field, watching the same sunset. The land still stretched wide in front of him, just as it always had. He knew the future was uncertain. He knew things might never go back to the way they were. But he also knew that the silence he had carried for so long was gone. The truth had taken something from him. It had taken comfort, ease, and the simple life he once knew. But it had also given him something, a chance to move forward without that heavy weight inside his chest. In the quiet of the evening, Willow Creek seemed to breathe again. Not in the easy way it had before, but in a deeper, slower way, like a town that had been shaken and was learning how to stand steady once more. Elena and Caleb, each in their own place, felt that same slow change inside themselves. Neither of them knew exactly what tomorrow would bring, but both of them knew they would face it with open eyes. Time moved forward in Willow Creek, the way it always did, slow and steady like the wind through the fields. The town had gone through its storm, and now it was learning how to live with what remained after the clouds passed. The streets were quieter again. The diner still opened each morning. Children still rode their bikes down the same roads. Life, in its simple way, kept going. For Elena, the days felt different now. She still worked at the diner, still tied on her apron every morning and poured coffee for the early customers. But she no longer felt like a shadow moving through the room. People greeted her with warm smiles. Some asked how her mother was doing. Some made small talk about the weather or their plans for the weekend. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't the same as before, but it felt real. Still, there was a restlessness inside her that wouldn't go away. One afternoon, she sat on the steps outside her house, watching the sun dip lower in the sky. The light turned the fields golden, and for a moment everything looked peaceful. But Elena knew she couldn't stay in Willow Creek forever. Too much had happened. Too many memories were tied to every street and every face. Her mother joined her, sitting carefully beside her. They watched the sky together in silence. "You've been thinking about leaving, haven't you?" her mother asked gently. Elena didn't deny it. She nodded. Her mother smiled, though there was sadness in her eyes. "Sometimes starting somewhere new isn't running away," she said. "Sometimes it's just moving forward." Those words stayed with Elena. Across town, Caleb stood in the middle of his land, looking out at the wide stretch of grass and fences. The ranch still belonged to him, still carried his family's name, but it no longer felt like the safe place it once had. The work had become harder. Some business connections never came back. Some neighbors kept their distance. But there were changes that surprised him too. A few people who had stepped away at first slowly returned. A neighbor brought over a basket of vegetables one morning. Another stopped by to help fix a broken gate without being asked. It wasn't a full return to how things had been, but it was something. Caleb learned to accept that something might be all there was. One evening, he sat at the kitchen table with his wife, going over papers and plans. They talked about the future, about what they could keep and what they might need to let go. The idea of selling part of the land came up, and it hung in the air between them. "It's not what I wanted," Caleb admitted, "but I don't want to hold on so tight that I can't breathe." His wife reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "We'll make it work," she said. Caleb nodded. For the first time in a long while, he believed her. Elena started preparing for her own change. She found a small job listing in a nearby town, not too far away, but far enough to feel like a fresh start. It was another diner, smaller and quieter. She sent in an application, not expecting much. A week later, she got a call. They wanted to meet her. The night before the interview, Elena couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about what it would mean to leave. She thought about her childhood home, the streets she knew by heart, and the people she would miss. She thought about the hurt, the loneliness, and the strength she had found in herself. In the morning, she told her mother about the interview. Her mother hugged her tightly. "No matter where you go, this will always be home," she said. "But you deserve to find a place where you can feel light again." Elena drove to the nearby town with her hands tight on the steering wheel, her heart racing. The town was a little bigger, a little busier. People walked down the sidewalks with purpose. Cars filled the streets. The interview went better than she expected. The manager was kind, asked about her experience, and listened when Elena talked about herself. When it was over, he smiled and said he would be in touch soon. Elena drove back to Willow Creek with a strange mix of hope and fear inside her. Caleb, meanwhile, had his own moment of change. A buyer from a nearby area came to look at a small section of his land. They walked together through the field, talking about prices and plans. Caleb listened, nodding, feeling a quiet sadness settle in his chest. This land had been part of his family's story for so long, but he also felt a sense of relief. Letting go of a piece of it felt like letting go of a piece of the weight he had been carrying. A few days later, Alina and Caleb saw each other again, this time on the main street in town. Alina was carrying a bag of groceries. Caleb was loading supplies into his truck. Their eyes met and they both paused. Caleb walked over. "I heard you might be leaving," he said. Alina looked surprised. "News still travels fast here," she said with a small smile. "I'm thinking about it," he nodded. "I don't blame you." They stood there for a moment, the sounds of the town around them. A car drove by. Someone laughed down the street. "I wanted to say something," Caleb said. "Before you go, if you do." Alina waited. "I know I can't change what happened," he continued. "But I hope you know that what you did mattered. It made me look at myself in a way I never had before." Alina thought about all the nights she had spent alone, wondering if telling the truth had been worth it. "I'm glad it meant something to someone," she said softly. Caleb nodded. "It did, to me." They shared a quiet moment, one that didn't need many words. A week later, Alina got the call. She got the job. She sat at the kitchen table, the phone still in her hand, her heart beating fast. Her mother looked at her, reading her face. "Well?" she asked. Alina smiled, tears filling her eyes. "I got it." They hugged, holding each other tightly. There was happiness in the moment, but also the soft ache of knowing something was ending. The next days were filled with small goodbyes. At the diner, her coworkers threw a simple little gathering for her. There was cake and coffee and a lot of hugs. Some customers came by just to wish her well. A few even brought small gifts like a scarf or a notebook. Alina thanked them all, feeling both full and heavy inside. Caleb heard about Alina's last day at the diner. He went even though he wasn't sure what he would say. He sat at the counter and ordered coffee like he had that day when he finally spoke up. Alina served him and they shared a small smile. "I hear you're off to a new place," he said. "Tomorrow," she replied. "Well," Caleb said, clearing his throat, "I wish you the best." "Thank you," Alina said. "I hope things get easier for you too," he nodded. "They already are in their own way." When Alina finished her shift, Caleb stood up and held out his hand. She shook it, a simple gesture that felt like a quiet goodbye. The next morning, Alina loaded her car with her few belongings. Her mother stood in the driveway, holding back tears. They hugged for a long time. "Call me when you get there," her mother said. "I will," Alina promised. She got into her car and took one last look at the house, the street, the town that had shaped her in ways she would never forget. Then she started the engine and drove away. As she passed the edge of Willow Creek, she felt a mix of sadness and freedom. The road ahead was open, and for the first time in a long while, that felt like a good thing. Caleb watched her drive past his land. He had been fixing a fence when he saw her car on the road. He lifted a hand in a small wave. She waved back, and then she was gone. The days that followed felt quieter for Caleb, but it was a different kind of quiet now, not heavy, not full of things unsaid. He focused on his work, on his family, on the small steps forward he was taking. The sale of part of the land went through, and with it came a sense of stability he hadn't felt in months. One evening, he stood at the edge of the field, watching the sunset. The sky was painted in soft colors, just like it had been on so many nights before. He thought about Alina out there somewhere, starting over. He thought about himself, standing here, learning how to live with what he had chosen. In Willow Creek, life slowly found a new rhythm. The diner stayed busy, the streets filled with familiar faces. The town didn't forget what had happened, but it didn't live inside it either. It became part of its story, something that had changed it, for better or worse. Alina called her mother from her new place. She talked about the new diner, the people, the way the air smelled different in the mornings. Her mother listened, smiling through the phone. "I'm proud of you," she said. Alina felt that pride settle in her chest, warm and steady. Caleb at home sat at the kitchen table with his family, laughing at something his son said. For the first time in a long while, the laughter didn't feel forced. It felt easy. Later that night, he stepped outside and looked up at the stars. The same stars that hung over Willow Creek, over the road where everything had begun, over the town that had been changed. He took a deep breath and let it out slowly. The truth had cost him a lot. It had taken comfort, certainty, and the simple life he once knew. But it had also given him something he hadn't expected, a sense of honesty with himself, a way to move forward without hiding. Miles away, Alina sat by the window in her small new room, looking out at a street she was just beginning to learn. Cars passed by. People walked by, strangers who didn't know her past, who only saw her as someone new. She smiled. Both of them, in their own places, carried the same quiet lesson with them. Life doesn't always reward you for doing what's right. Sometimes it takes something away. But it also opens doors you never knew were there. And in the space between loss and hope, between what was and what could be, both Alina and Caleb found something simple and strong: the chance to begin again.